Firstly, I want to thank everyone that's been so generous with their time and their help. Carol, all the interns, Marcel. So, with no further ado, hopefully it'll be short and sweet. My work. So, I want to start with giving a little bit of the background. It's since youth I've been always fascinated and perplexed by the natural world and natural phenomena and what happens out there is unknown. And part of that is perhaps because my parents, they're from Cambodia and they're refugees, and so for them, nature was associated with fear, danger, and death. And so they always forbade us to go into forests. And so because it was forbidden, then it became like something that was fascinating. And I always wanted to know more, but I never could. So the closest thing that for me was trying to understand what happens in natural systems in the world and processes of transformation was to try to learn it from school. And so that's why I continued my schooling into the sciences, and I wanted to create something. I always wanted to create things that were never there before. So I went into synthetic chemistry to make new things that never were before. But during my thesis years, still something was missing, and I couldn't understand why it is that my search was never really fulfilled. And so I continued to explore that passion that I had with trying to understand what happens in the unknown and in the natural world, but through the pathway of the arts, which to me was a more spiritual and emotional connection to the world around me rather than just a textbook explanation. So like with most things in life, it's through serendipity. So I was going to major in painting, but there was one slot in the evening that fit my schedule, and it was a sculpture class. And that's how I fell in love with sculpture, the one class that wasn't supposed to be. And so still couldn't get away with painting because this was submitted for a painting class, but still I discovered the pleasure of welding on steel. So here you can see detail of welding on steel and how to emboss steel, and then trying to add pigments on top of that. And with my background, I tried to make a recipe of how to actually oxidize some of the pigments directly onto the steel surface. And then you can see you're privy to this because you know how everyone says, take progress picture, but no one takes progress pictures. So these are progress pictures. And the bottom is carved basswood, and I mounted them with like an idiosyncratic kind of bolt system, and then cut every bolt, and so everything's bolted properly, everything disassembles, so it's easier for me to actually move it around because it's actually really, really heavy. And then I try to move into verticality, so this is actually pretty high up, and thinking a lot about like clouds and their formation and how different climates have different types of cloud because of the pressure that surrounds us. And then eventually moved to a material that was lighter because steel was just weighing me down so much. So I moved to aluminum, which is lighter, and then I discovered that I could also oxidize, so make a chemical reaction on top of the aluminum. So here it's sodium chloride, which is table salt, that I patinaed on top of the aluminum. So essentially torch with propane and oxyacetylene so that you can create a reaction onto the aluminum and then emboss it with these little cracks. And underneath there's some LEDs from which light can shine through. And then you can see that on the right, I started gouging onto plywood, and I started loving that process of that subtractive process of gouging plywood. And so I moved on to a combination that was still kind of sculptural, but also painterly, and thinking a lot about perception and how, where does the sky start and where do the clouds begin? And so I started hiking a lot. Again, that obsession with trying to understand what I didn't understand when I was young. And then asked myself, what can I do with aluminum else than just making a patina? So I decided I was going to learn to TIG weld, and I started making like different root system and finding trees that were discarded on Mount Royal, which is a mountain near Montreal where I grew up. And it's a funny thing, like being an artist and a sculptor, you kind of develop a thick skin because I had to haul these branches through the metro system. And no one, like, they kind of want to ask you, but they don't want to ask you, you know? And so it's interesting. You kind of like learn to like not care about what other people are saying. You just haul your material and you just keep going, right? And so this was interesting to me. It was a learning experience outside of school. And so I started, again, where can I take aluminum? So I decided to take a casting class, so to cast aluminum in a foundry. And then I made this little plate here. And again, that melding of the natural and the industrial. So I found a piece of driftwood and I thought maybe I could make something biomorphic, something more animal versus industrial. And so this meshing became a platform kind of like this, where this was cast in aluminum. And I thought to myself, well, I love how like that heat, that fire, like every time we pour it, it's a lost wax casting method for bronze and aluminum cast, not for aluminum, but for bronze. So I learned how to do that, and I kind of love that, like that alchemy of turning that fire up, and then the heat that started to spurt from all that. And so I decided I was gonna paint with fire. So I used a propane torch and an oxyacetylene torch to create plywood that was torched, and I could eventually paint it. And I was really inspired by some of the etchings of Goya, looking back into like revolution and how things happen, and how fire is sometimes a sign of destruction, but also a sign of regeneration and of further hope. And so just the movement that's natural of something that has a higher temperature rising up purely because it's the process that's a natural thing to do. And then eventually taking that carving that I was doing before, that I'd learned to love through die grinders and just carving, chiseling by hand, and trying to find a way to incorporate steel into the structure. And so I decided to make something in homage to Andrei Tarkovsky, who is a film director, and in his memoir called Sculpting in Time, Thoughts on Cinematography, he writes about how it's often misbelieved or misunderstood that the artist is looking for a subject. Rather, oftentimes the subject is already within the artist, and it starts to grow and then demand expression, and it wants to come out, a little bit like childbirth. And so I thought that was really interesting. And for him, the process of art making is a kind of salvation. And so I thought that was super interesting, because planting seed, in some respects, it's not always for you, but it's for the generation after. So I was thinking a lot about that, and also processes of balance, because again, another shop in the metal shop, so trying to balance this took me 3 weeks. So just like you're like, oh, it's easy, I'm gonna draw it and it's gonna work. But no, like it keeps fighting against you and fighting against you. And I was, again, that thing of like harrowing the soil and planting things, and the weather is against you, and the heat is against you, and insects are against you, but like you still want to plant something, so you keep going at it. And to me that was very important. It became a kind of pattern in my life, that it felt like I was fighting against something, but that if I kept going just a little further, a little more every day, something good might come out of it. And so I decided to move away from that and decide to bend copper tubing. It's not easy to bend copper tubing because it's hollow, so I had to find a way to like bend it without it kinking and breaking. And then here, in this work, I was thinking a lot about process of sublimation. So sublimation is a physical process in which a substance is solid and turns into gas, or is gas and turns into solid. And so I was thinking a lot about how sublimation can also be a state of mind, how you sublimate. And that's because I commute a lot and I take the metro system. I don't know if you're all familiar with the metro system, but oftentimes it's underground, and then you step from like the ground level to like the underground, and then you enter a different altered state. And to me, it's a kind of process of sublimation. And in between, you're from ground level to like being underground, you're kind of someone else, you're just a commuter. But when you get out, you're yourself again. So I found that really interesting. And then working with new material, with concrete, plexiglass, and welded steel, and the copper again, and my charred plywood, and the gouging. And another shot here. So I learned how to use solvent to actually glue plexiglass together and make little forms in it and embed them like little clouds in an assembly line. And again, another process shot. So this was perhaps one of the most difficult pieces I've ever done because it was so technical. So there's a lot of compound angle. So compound angles are not just like single angle, they twist a different way too. So I had to learn to like get everything aligned, welded together, and make sure that everything fits for the plywood to rest on. So it was extremely challenging, but I've learned a lot from just doing that. And I moved to Ithaca, as Carol mentioned, to do my MFA at Cornell. And so it feels like every time I move to a different place, there's a setback. I have to adjust to a new place. Like Nora was saying, you're always from away, and so people know. And there's something about being from away that you start always a little behind people who are already there. And so when I got there, I had no material, nothing. Like I was expected to have a show in 2 weeks, but I didn't have any material. I didn't know what click was because I'm Canadian. So like I had to figure all of this out in 2 weeks. But again, serendipity, I decided I was going to take an acting class because who knows, why not? And so I took the acting class, and at the end of the first class, there was a piece of cinefoil on the floor. And cinefoil is this black aluminum material that you see in the cinema industry. They use it to cover light. And so I was thinking, oh, that's really actually sculptural. It's interesting. What could I do with this? And at the same time, for many years during my thesis, I was rock climbing a lot, was an avid rock climber, and I was thinking, I love these structures. Like, how can I capture the essence of these structures? What can I do with it that might do justice to their beauty? And so I started working with this material. It's actually not so much like a sheet. It bends and it cuts a lot, so it has a way of finding your flesh. And so that's cinefoil. But I also work with copper a lot, and I discovered that it became a meditative thing where instead of me trying to sculpt something, it was the stone or the rock that was trying to mold me into its own shape. And I found that fascinating. So again, going back to, there's always something about painting that draws me back. And so with this material, I thought it's also a great canvas, but I can shape it. So I'll shape this canvas. And I was thinking a lot about processes of formation of, again, changes of state. What can snow see as it descends towards the ground? And so this piece came about from just that simple thought. And then, so there's a slogan in Ithaca that goes, Ithaca is gorgeous, because there's so many gorges. And so gorgeous, like the waterfall. Yeah. So, I love the sinuous pattern of just the water flowing down and cascading, and I'm thinking, how might I find a way to fix this moment in time, but also allow the viewer to interact with it and to always keep changing perspective as they go around the work. So I thought, wire, let me try to work with steel wire. I've never done that. So I started working with steel wire, how to bend them, how to actually get the shape to hold. But also, while this is very big, like massive, it's extremely light as well. So it plays in my favor in some case. And then at the same time, there's a lot of raptors in the area, but I never saw their nests. So I became really interested by how these large creatures who hunt all the time, where do they nest? Like why can't we ever see their nests? And so I was thinking a lot about vessels and things they contain, things that emerge out of vessels and things that enter back into vessels. So cells bursting or a galaxy going into supernova explosion. So those are just thoughts that came through my mind as I was looking at raptors flying overhead. And then got forced back to Montreal during the pandemic. I think a lot of us got displaced back somewhere else during the pandemic. So a friend of mine was generous because we went to their parents' house. I was able to commandeer their studio and work in it. And I was thinking a lot about, at the time, of the notion of loss, about human lives being lost, and how might I try to make sense of all this while I'm being trapped inside someone else's place. And at the same time, there was an announcement of the discovery of the Higgs boson. So in particle physics, the Higgs boson, more or less in layman's term, I would say, in one of the great mystery of particle physics is how does mass get ascribed into a particle? We kind of understand more or less how they're charged, like they're positively charged, negatively charged, but where do their mass comes from? It's actually still a mystery in particle physics. And so this explanation of the Higgs boson, which they purport is how particles obtain their mass. And to me, that's fascinating because it's something out of nowhere. We can't really understand it, but it gives mass to everything that's around us, which is kind of like the process of loss, right? It's someone that you love dearly and is no longer there, but their weight is still being felt in you, although they've disappeared. And so I found that really powerful. And then I was walking along a canal, so near where my friend's studio is, there's like a little canal that the city built for people to just lounge around. And I found this boulder, this little granite, and I thought, I'm gonna pick it up and bring it to my friend's studio, but I had no idea how heavy it was. So it was a kind of performance, and thinking back, I should have filmed it because I was literally pushing the stone. And after an hour and 20 minutes or so, got into the studio. But I was thinking a lot here about motions of planets and precession around the sun and the earth, and how it looks like the sun is setting, but it's not. Every day looks the same, more or less. Do physical phenomenon have a memory of what happened the day before? So I was thinking a lot about subjectivity, and does that happen for natural phenomena? And then in the studio, in the cloister of it, I started experimenting a lot. There were pieces of driftwood in it, so I started to shape pieces of driftwood, but also at the same time, he had Japanese paper in his studio, and so I started to experiment with Japanese paper, how to get the imprint of different figures, of different objects in Japanese paper. What I found fascinating with the juxtaposition of both is how there's a kind of heaviness or lightness, or a kind of darkness and lightness. And so I love having these two converse with one another. And I kind of developed a technique by having the cinefoil become the sacrificial template. So I would mold something with cinefoil, and then I would lacquer it with Vaseline, and then put the paper on top, carefully stitch it out, and then reassemble the structure. So this is what you're seeing here. So again, everything's molded carefully with the cinefoil, and then it's taken out of the structure, and then I stitch it back with paper. So it's a very laborious process, but somehow it gives a fidelity to the object that I can kind of take out like a snake skin almost. And I started playing with Photoshop. So these 4 chairs don't exist, there's only one. But I kind of understood how light functions and how photography in some respect, there's an element of deception, but there's also an element of magic in it. So I really found that fascinating. So during my time in isolation, I made a lot of discoveries. So that was great. And then again, with the steel wire, what might I do with steel wire and paper? I started experimenting with oxidation. How long might I leave it in there to make more oxidation? So the oxidation is this rust color that you see here. And depending on how much glue or water I was adding, how long I was keeping it, there would be more or less of it. And I started playing with that. It's almost like painting in some respect, but with steel wire. And then I started wondering, how might I take that further or elsewhere? And I started reading this book by Theodore Schrank called, oh man, now my memory's Sensible Chaos, the flowing of forms in air and water. And I got really kind of enamored by the writing because in it he describes how water courses through the planet, and does water have memory of where it's been? And if you think about it, like every time you touch something, it touches you back. And so you're kind of affected and changed by it. So why wouldn't water be the same? Why wouldn't it have a memory? So when you were born, if you think about it, inside the womb, you're surrounded by water. And it shapes all of your bones. If you look at bones, the structures of a turning, there's a handedness to our bones. Does the same water that came from a water somewhere in Niagara Falls has ever reached you while you were born? You know, I found that really interesting. And so I wanted to try to capture how the flow of water went into a bark and out of the bark. And here I was working with copper a lot, learn how to make little wedges, and then try to sediment the juncture of the steel wire. And then, so it became known at some point during the pandemic that it was okay to go out and actually just enjoy time with friends. So we started to go hiking, and they would go hiking and I would do my art. So I would bring my cinefoil that I had painted in the studio, and I would go out and start shaping things just around me. And I found that so meditative because I would hear the sound of the water around me, and just everything about it felt just so good, but also so foreign because I had just emerged out of the studio, and then there I was in the woods. So I found that almost like a cathartic experience. You come out of it differently. And then I started shaping even larger structure. And then from these larger structure, I would go on to create kind of hangings, because again, influenced by gorges and the flowing of water, but also the streaming of light through these natural formations. And I would make a few other versions of it. So it's actually quite large, and there's something about it that evokes a little bit of the spiritual. There's one architect named Dario Anto who works a lot with light, and he made a few monuments that were church-like, or churches. And what I found fascinating about him is that he started out as a boxer and then became an architect. So that's super interesting because prior to him becoming an architect, you didn't have to have a degree in architecture to become an architect. And he's one of the world's most known architects. And if that had come into effect, we would never have his work on this in this world. So I found that kind of interesting to know these little facts about how regulations prevent creativity in some parts of the world. And then I started shaping trees because I was thinking, well, the natural progression from an inanimate, seemingly inanimate object from a boulder would be tree roots. And so I would go and make these large sculptures, bring them back to the studio. And again, it kind of tests you walking through campus with other students running about, and you have this huge black thing that you're carrying, and it makes an awful sound. It's so loud because it's aluminum banging against aluminum. And so you sound like a marching band, but again, it makes you grow thicker skin. So I found that to be really nice to like be able to experience. And I started looking a lot into roots, micellar system, how fungus interacts with trees, and how actually it's believed that it's not true that they're really competing against one another. They're actually all helping one another grow into a larger ecosystem. So this belief that trees actually compete against one another is actually recently being debunked from research in the University of British Columbia. And here I was thinking a lot about the writing of Manuel de Landa, who does social criticism. And he talks a lot about something called the mechanic phylum, meaning how inert objects or matter actually travel and are actually really kinetic. So if you think about it, the Earth itself is quite mobile. It rotates without you knowing it. And somehow the formation of planets is kind of still the same. So a lot of the time, accretion happens by having a lot of the mass come towards the center, and the things of lower mass goes towards the edges. So that's planets like Jupiter and Saturn. They're mostly gas-based. But if you think about us as living beings, we're very similar. We have bones inside of us that's mineral. And this mineral actually allows the flesh, that's the lower mass entities, to actually come around us so that we can become creatures that travel the planet. And so he's talking a lot about how seemingly inert matter actually roams the planet. And now it's really technology. So all of us have this, which is essentially inert material, but it travels the planet through us. And I found that really interesting. And here I started making larger structures. So again, back to that like vessel egg shape. I also made a few performances where I crawled in and out of it. That was interesting because it was in the middle of winter and my hands froze quickly. And so that was one of my first experimentation with performance. And it's another example here, larger incorporation of steel with the paper. And then here, thinking a lot again about root system, micellar system, and also rhizome, how different nodes of interconnected nodes actually feed a living entity, which is kind of like us, how our knowledge comes from different places. We're nourished by very much different things. And how might the creature that lives in the darkness actually encounter a creature that lives in lightness? So I found that really challenging to make. The whole structure is actually held really, really precariously. Everything is it's either welded together or strung together with steel wire. So it took me roughly 6 hours to get this standing, which I think it's interesting because you encounter something and you think it's kind of stable, and they tell you don't touch in the gallery. So thankfully there was that aspect, because if someone had touched it, it'd probably all crumble. So yeah. And I was lucky enough to be able to collaborate with the material science group while I was at Cornell. So they gave me iridescent polymer. So in this respect, an iridescent polymer for their work, depending on the angle at which you would tilt it, you would see a different color. So they would use it for lasers and other sensor systems, but those were the batches that were not good, and so they just gave it to me to play with. So I was able to just paint with this. The only drawback with this is that it dries in 3 seconds. So I had to be really quick, trying to do little things. And so I decided to make like little patterns, almost like Chinese calligraphy, just little dots, little shapes. And then I learned to weave that into a copper net. So glass is really extremely brittle, so I would learn to make a jig out of aluminum and then just run it through, make all the little kinks with copper, insert all the glass slides, remove all the, so it's kind of a laborious, repetitive system, but it's kind of how weaving happens. There's a kind of meditative aspect to it, just the repetition of making knots, removing knots, making knots, removing knots. And eventually I would string this along, and then there were cores that were taken from the New York Museum. They have a little off gallery space where they archive everything, and the geologists there agreed to talk with me about discarded cores. So the thing about discarded cores is that they need three information: where it comes from, its location and height, and its location and latitude. So if they're missing any of those, for them it's useless. But for me, it was super interesting to just being able to grab what was useless for a museum. In many respects, I think about a lot about things that were lost or people that were lost, and still for us they're important even though we don't know where they are, how deep they are, or where they are. So I wanted to be able to honor these cores that were drilled for a purpose, but now found no purpose, so I kind of repurposed them. And again, experimentation with oxidation of the copper. And again, you're seeing the weaving here. And there's something about it that it's difficult to see in this picture, but depending again on the angle at which you move, it's either blue or orange. So even the black ones have a blue or orange tinge. And I was thinking a lot about perspective, how in a single event, depending where you are in space or where you are in your frame of mind, you might encounter the same event really differently. And then I think that for me, at least in the practice of art making, it was really important to be able to do different things, to experiment differently. So for this work, I decided to use something called a sonic exciter. So if you look at something like this, which is an amplifier, there's essentially going to be a sonic exciter and a diaphragm. So the diaphragm actually oscillates as the sonic exciter beats on it. And it's this oscillation and the airwaves that travel to your ear that makes you be able to hear. And so a sonic exciter, I just remove that diaphragm, and I make my foil become the diaphragm. So I'm going to exit this briefly to show you. Okay, hope it works. Oh, it's hard to hear. Okay, well, so in order to generate the sound, I started playing with generative sound. So it's a way to generate sound by having bits of audio data. So I took data from NASA flybys in outer space, and I meshed them up together and allowed that program to synthesize something different depending on when you enter the gallery space, when you exit the gallery space. So in some respect, how to bring back the celestial and the cosmic onto a terrestrial plane. And here, okay, I need to go back. Okay. So this is what I experimented with here. Sound, but also, again, back to the copper weaving, how I might distort the net. It might actually become sinuous, although it's an industrial material. And I was really lucky to be able to be a resident at Storm King 2 years ago. It's a sculpture garden. They allowed me to be there freely. So at the time that the museum would close, I would have the sculpture garden to myself. So I would just amble through and just be able to be there with the artwork and the hawks and the owls that would fly there. So it was kind of magical being there. So I decided I was gonna try something different because there's no one around me. So I decided to make a performance on the field by using my Cinefoil and making it look like it's wavering through the field, because there was a piece by Maya Lin, who is a visual artist close by, and she made something called wave field by having the earth become the sculpture. So having the earth become mounds and become like a wave field. And I was really inspired by that. And so I started making like little stop motion animation from that. So I started making little mounds that look like waves. And let me get exit. And there's something a little, okay, I don't know if it's gonna work, but, yes. So it's a little animation that I made. It looks almost like little maggots that are crawling through space, but I found that kind of inspiring, being able to work outdoors in the middle of the night, making little animation. That's cute. Okay. Okay, that's where is it? Okay. I learned a lot from it. There was really time of experimentation for me. And I think that as a sculptor moving towards these different mediums with an element of duration is kind of interesting, because when you enter a gallery space and you encounter the sculptures, it's you in the space. There isn't really a time element, but when you look at a video, there's like a start and an end. So there's a kind of direction to it. There are choices that are made by the director about what you're seeing at what time, what sequence. And so as a sculptor, being able to control that element of time is kind of challenging, but also it gives you that kind of opportunity to direct the viewer into a little emphasis or attention to different things that you might have otherwise missed if you had just ambled through gallery space yourself. And so I started moving towards experimental performance, so making these very large sculptural things, and then working with them through like making a performance. And like in one of the artist residency, I was making live performance to the people who were present. And every time I go to a place, I usually try to research where I'm going, because I think it's important to honor who were there before us. And in this case, I was at Willapa Bay, which is in Oysterville in Washington. And in that place, there's the Willapa Bay people, and they're essentially a indigenous tribe that has no recognition on the federal grounds, meaning that they don't receive any funding because there's been like inter-tribal rivalry that's kind of prevented them from getting federal funding. So it's a little strange, but apparently it's not that uncommon because there's limited funding for natural reserves. And so they try to like battle tribes between the tribes to get funding. And so I found that kind of strange, but also perhaps this is essentially what's happening in every country. So this performance is a kind of return to how some of these cosmologies and mythologies of the Willapa Bay people, and thinking about how they have the myth of the salmon that goes every year, returns back to its river and lays out its egg. But it's prevented from doing so because of different tribes that prevent it from actually swimming upriver. And this is hopefully the last slide. So recently I started returning back into painting, although for so many years I've been doing sculpture. Somehow I started incorporating an element of my sculptural practice into the sculpture, into the painting itself. So adding little eye hooks, trying to mount it in such a way that it became precarious. And I find it, the correlation between the time it happens to me is intriguing, because 7 years from the time I started making these paintings on steel, I started making these paintings on cinefoil. And they say that on average, every 7 years, your body has regenerated every cell or tissue, so you're an entirely different person. And the mere fact that I've returned to painting, I think it's trying to tell me something about how there's like this cyclical nature of how I create things, and I can't disregard it. And so, again, before I was painting about aerial, like clouds, and what I would see from snow and the falling of rain. And now I'm thinking a lot more about geology and about the earth and what's inside the planet. And when I was talking to Marcel about the marble, I was thinking a lot about how he's saying that marble comes from limestone, but with the heat and the pressure, it metamorphoses, it becomes marble. And really, it's like that process of the grain of the crystal becoming actually simpler, that it's fusing. So limestone has a lot of grain, and then marble actually becomes a simpler structure purely because of heat and pressure. And during another residency, I got to talk a lot to neuroscientists, and they were telling me that between the age of infancy and the age of 2, the brain actually grows a lot of neurons, like exponentially. And somehow, for some reason, between the age of 2 and the age of 20, the brain cuts about half of the neurons that it's producing. But we don't understand why. There's something about how we evolve as creatures, that's simply what we do. And which is kind of fascinating because the planet does the same thing. It makes things that are lots of grain from granite become something that's simpler, like marble. So there seems to be a reason why the planet does this and chooses to go from disordered system into something that's simpler, which is in some respect against the laws of physics, because we believe in something called quote-unquote entropy, which is essentially having lots of difference actually increases the state of a physical state. So meaning that when there's more difference, it's actually a more natural state. Yet what we're seeing is that the limestone transforms into something simpler. So again, thinking a lot about that and what does that mean in terms of, are we actually fighting against the natural order, or is it actually something that's already preordained? So that's why I'm here, to trying to resolve that gap between the celestial and the terrestrial, and how we might try to combine them and reunite them into something that's paradoxical, which is perhaps the most natural state of things. And just thinking about that is kind of wild and crazy and like beautiful, which is like everything and everyone here. So thank you so much.